You're going to want to watch to the end of this video so you can get the 8 takeaways about rent control and learn the alternative. Today, as California debates Proposition 10 and the world wonders, is rent control something that we should look forward to, something that we should encourage? Or is it a problem? Is rent control really just a political guise of affordable housing? Or does it really provide affordable housing? Or does it do something worse? Let's find out. Because the topic of affordable housing and rent control is so unpopular to oppose in the United States, I left, and I'm coming to you from Frieden, Germany. Okay, maybe that's not really why I'm here, but let's at least give you the content and the reasons you're here. As always, my friends, know that I'm not just coming to you with a bunch of garbage. I'm coming to you with studies, facts, and solid perspective. Now let's start by defining what rent control is. Rent control is essentially a price ceiling, which Economics 101 tells us that price ceilings lead to inefficiencies in the marketplace. But does economic theory hold true when we look at what actually happens when rent control is put into place? And a huge hotbed for discussion is California's Proposition 10, which would remove the limitations for individual municipalities to be able to introduce rent control. Now let's get into some reasons for and against rent control. Proponents of rent control argue that if we have rent control, as in limited price increases or price increases of rents only to levels that are deemed to be fair, to give a fair return on investment to investors, but not displace minorities or people who have lived in communities for a long time, then affordable housing should be the mandate of a society, and therefore rent control should be instilled. Problem number 1 with rent control: minorities may not be the sole benefactor, or people who need affordable housing may not be the only people benefiting from rent control. In fact, studies have shown that higher net worth individuals and higher net worth families have actually found ways to benefit from rent control, locking in lower rents because they're able to come more prepared, dress the part as being the perfect tenant, and are able to not only provide the most convincing story, but be there before anybody else who might possibly have to work a normal job. As a result, studies have shown that rent-controlled flats in New York City actually ended up renting to people with higher median incomes than non-rent controlled flats. And between you and me, I don't think anybody in the city has ever seen anybody vlog. It's kind of weird. Here's something to know about rent control. When a tenant occupies a rent-controlled property, there's a limit to how much their rent can go up. The problem is that eliminates the desire for most landlords to improve their properties, thus leading to a higher likelihood of health and safety issues on the property, such as peeling, lead-based paint, lack of railing maintenance or smoke detectors, carbon monoxide, or overall upkeep and maintenance of the property, as rents being relatively low in rent-controlled properties compared to the market. Especially as time goes on, investors try to do their best to eke out whatever profit they can. As a result, they tend to spend less and try to keep their operating costs as low as possible. Now, there are exceptions to this. In some cities, such as San Francisco, you can do capital improvements to properties, but that also doesn't tend to bode well for tenants, because when capital improvements are made, San Francisco allows the landlord to raise the rents. What happens when the rent raises is the unit no longer becomes affordable, and all of a sudden a new market rent is established, which eliminates the idea of affordable housing in the first place. Hallo, wie geht's? Hi. Sehr gut, danke. YouTube, richtig. Ciao. See, this problem comes from what are called fair rental policies. That is, these policies, these rent control policies that exist, are supposed to give landlords a fair return on their investment, but what's oftentimes deemed fair by rent control advocates tend to be very low rent returns.
Because landlords can't afford to improve or even maintain their rent-controlled apartments.
See, and we just talked to some German youth, and the problem with rent control as well is that the youth generally get screwed the most. Generally, younger families are the ones that are not able to take full advantage of rent control because they're more likely to have to upgrade their living situation as their family dynamics grow or their job positions change. It's generally older generations that are most able to maximize the value of rent control. The value of rent control is pegged at about $300 for every extra year you live there. That's because the market rents for rent-controlled properties stays relatively low while the market increases at faster rates and faster paces, thus essentially creating a wedge which incentivizes longer-term tenancy. So we're already seeing three major problems here. The resourceful people get rent-controlled properties first, all in a mad dash to secure new rent-controlled listings first. Investors often don't spend as much on rent-controlled properties to maintain them or keep them safe or updated, as a result leading to lower property values unless they're in areas like San Francisco where there are exceptions to being able to make capital improvements, but then they just raise the rent and rent control starts all over again at a higher pegged rate, again leading to higher income people living in those rent-controlled units. Now let's touch on what's actually most likely to happen with rent-controlled properties. The more there are rent-controlled properties, the more owners are incentivized to extract their property from the control of rent control. There are a few ways an owner can do this. An owner can do what is known as a forced eviction and say, hey, guess what? I'm moving into the property. Then evict the tenant, move into the property, renovate it, and sell it as either an individual condo or a tenancy in common property. And guess to which population renovated condos or tenancy in common properties generally sell to? Higher income or higher net worth individuals. Again, reducing the supply of rental housing and increasing the prices in certain neighborhoods by introducing more renovated, higher quality product to the market, leading to, again, less affordable housing. Now, of course, there are tenants who can benefit from this, and this is called a welfare advantage of rent control. And that's that tenants who have been in a property for a long period of time and have such a low relative rent, they could actually demand a payout or negotiate very heavily with a landlord to essentially buy them out of their rent-controlled property. That is, of course, unless the owner evokes the forced eviction method. Now, I will say forced evictions aren't necessarily super common. We do see a lot of rent-controlled tenants accept and negotiate buyout offers, and those tenants do stand to benefit. But what we're actually seeing is that while some rent-controlled tenants today might be able to benefit, they're doing so at the expense of future tenants by reducing the supply of affordable housing, which is the purpose of rent control in the first place. Number 5, because rent control limits the expected return on investment, people are less likely to build. Ew, there's a worm and there's poopy right there. Ugh. Builders have less of an incentive to build properties for affordable housing projects. They're much more incentivized to just build high-end condos and sell them. And that's exactly what's happening in San Francisco and is part of the reason why San Francisco has gotten so expensive. That's right, rent control has led prices to increase in San Francisco. Now, if we consider some basic economic theory, we immediately see that anytime we introduce a price ceiling, we immediately create what is called a deadweight loss to society.
So a price ceiling causes a deadweight loss to society. The society loses with a price ceiling.
And sadly, based on these arguments that we've already made, we're starting to see exactly where that deadweight loss is coming from. That is, we're actually seeing rent control do the opposite of what it's intended to do. It's intended to make housing more affordable, and it's doing just the opposite. In areas that were studied, prices tended to be 40% lower for rent-controlled properties relative to non-rent-controlled properties in a similar area. Which the argument then is, great, maybe housing's more affordable. But wait a minute, that's not the point. The point isn't to have lower sales prices, which again disincentivizes owners from spending money on their properties. And that's where we can look at areas like Cambridge, where rent control was removed, and immediately the amount of construction permits that started getting pulled went through the roof. In addition to that, we have esteemed economist at the New York Times, Paul Krugman, who quotes, "People literally don't want to know. A few months ago, when a San Francisco official proposed the study of the city's housing crisis, there was a firestorm of opposition from tenant advocacy groups to the idea of removing rent control limitations. They argued that even to study the situation was a step on the road to ending rent control, and they may well have been right. Because studying the issue might lead to the obvious recognition, the recognition that rent control doesn't lead to affordable housing. It's not the correct solution, but there is an alternative. What is the better alternative if rent control doesn't actually do what we think it should do? If rent control actually makes housing less affordable, then the best available alternative at the moment seems to be either higher welfare checks, higher voucher payments when rents do increase, or some form of direct subsidies to tenants when they look for housing. But by placing a ceiling on rents, all we're doing is creating a political guise that appears like we are doing a political good, but all we are doing is putting on a theater act that actually decreases the amount of affordable housing available to the people who need it most. Thanks to rent controls, we see a reduction in the rental supply, exacerbating the problem. We see wealthier people taking advantage of the ability to rent properties by being the first past the post at their availability and putting the best presentation forward when they race to apply for rentals. We see landlords either force evict tenants or buy them out to renovate the properties and end up selling them as condos or tenant in common projects, again reducing the supply of affordable housing and the affordable housing that's left, unless there are some kind of exemptions for capital improvements, ends up with a greater likelihood of deferred maintenance and health and safety issues. So next time you consider rent control, consider these arguments.